Who is Vladimir Putin? And I'm going to say again, people are going to go, oh, why are you bashing up on Putin? What about Vladimir Zelensky, the president of Ukraine? I'm going to do a piece on him as well. And the point here is just to go into some of the issues that are around the whole war in Ukraine subject and bring them to light. I have already done a piece called What Was Putin Thinking?, where I talk about his speech that he gave on the day before the invasion in Ukraine and some of the motives that he expressed clearly in that speech. This time I'm going to be talking about Vladimir Putin in terms of his history and his political apparatus and his political history to get a sense of what kind of guy is this, what kind of president is he. Because he is the current president of the Russian Federation, as we know, and he's variously been either prime minister or president since 1999 for the United Russia Party. I'm going to go through his personal life now, then a bit of his professional background, then some constitutional amendments he made to guarantee himself effectively president for the rest of his life, which he otherwise couldn't have done. And then I want to talk about some of his the suppression of his political opponents and his autocratic and authoritarian tendencies. But anyway, it's not all negative, but it's quite negative. Personal life. His personal life is actually a taboo subject, and the Russian media and journalists report that they face threats to their career, threats or career destruction for prying too far into it. So a lot of this is very unknown. Secrecy also clouds his childhood, although it is known that his brother Victor was taken from his mother at birth for state protection and placed in a children's home, and then died during the 872-day German siege of Leningrad during World War II. Putin is known to visit the cemetery where Victor is buried. He was married to a woman called Lyudmila, and I can't pronounce her surname, and this is going to happen a few times in this segment. Some of them are really complex. Shkrebneva. He was married to her for 30 years between 1983 and 2013, and it's known that he has at least 2 daughters. But their identities are not officially confirmed. They go by secret identities, and Putin's refused to answer direct questions about whether he even has children, but he's referred to them indirectly at different times. For example, when he was talking about the Sputnik COVID vaccine, he said one of his daughters had taken it. It's assumed that the daughters are both researchers. One is an endocrinologist called Masha. The other is a financial specialist called Katya. I think Masha's married with a child. Katya's divorced. Putin has been linked also to a girlfriend, Alina Kabaeva, I think, although the first newspaper to allege this was forced to shut down. It's rumoured that they're married with multiple children, though Putin will not confirm it. The Russian state media watchdog blocked a news website in 2020 for alleging that Putin had a child with another woman, Svetlana Krivonogich, Krivonogich. Lots of Russians are going to be laughing at this. In terms of his professional background, after studying law at Leningrad State University, Putin served for 15 years as a foreign intelligence officer at the KGB. The KGB was created in 1954, and it was to serve as the, quote, sword and shield of the Communist Party, unquote, in the USSR. It was responsible for foreign intelligence, domestic counterintelligence, technical intelligence, protection of the political leadership and security of the USSR's frontiers. And during the Soviet era, it was also responsible for the surveillance of the population. You know, a properly communistic, statist, authoritarian, nasty piece of work organisation, if I could just put it mildly. In 1990, Putin retired from active KGB service with the rank of lieutenant colonel. In 1994, he becomes the first deputy mayor of St. Petersburg. In 1996, he moves to Moscow and he joins the presidential staff as a deputy to Pavel Borodin, the Kremlin's chief administrator. He then moves up in administrative positions, and by July 1998, he's the director of the FSB, which is the KGB's successor. Shortly afterwards, he becomes the secretary of the Security Council, and then in 1999, President Boris Yeltsin appoints Putin the prime minister of the Russian Federation. So quite a stratospheric rise there over the course of a decade, really stratospheric. And on 31st of December that very same year, Yeltsin unexpectedly announces his resignation and he appoints Putin acting president of the Russian Federation. Then there's an election in March of 2000 and Putin wins with 53% of the vote. And then in his first term, the economy grows, things are looking good. They're coming sort of out of some of the difficulties of recession in the 90s. And of course, he's therefore re-elected in 2004. In 2007, Putin's party wins 64.3% of the vote in the parliamentary election as well, not the presidential, but the parliamentary. In 2008, Putin hits his constitutional term limit as president. In Russia, much like it is in the US, it used to be that you could only serve as president for a maximum of 2 terms. And so what happens is that Putin names Dmitry Medvedev as his successor. Medvedev then wins the 2008 election and appoints Putin as prime minister, and they did the old switcheroo again in 2012, where Putin goes back up to president, Medvedev goes back to prime minister. They also swapped in the role of chairman of the United Russia Party. Putin held the post whilst he was prime minister, but Medvedev took it once Putin was president again in 2012, and Medvedev has stayed there as the chairman of that party ever since, and Putin has stayed on now as president ever since. And you say, well, hang on, how did Putin do that? I thought that the whole point was that he could only be the president for 2 terms, and that was in the constitution. Well, he pursued a range of amendments to the Russian constitution, which made this very possible. And what he did was, well, here's some of the amendments. There's actually a package of 206 amendments, which were all passed together, and I'll get to the reason why in a second, but let me get some of the key ones out. The first one is that it allowed him, this package of amendments that he pursued, allowed him to retain office until 2036, when he will be about 84 years old, by not only allowing 4 terms rather than 2 terms in the presidency, but actually guaranteeing through a parliamentary amendment that was thrown up at the very last second by an ally of his, it was guaranteeing that the 2 terms Putin had already served would not count in the new constitution towards his 4 terms. And so he's going to get a total of 6 terms in the presidency, presuming no further changes and presuming at 84 he doesn't want to continue. Secondly, the package of amendments allowed the president to dismiss and appoint the prime minister. It also allowed the president to direct the government's work program. It allowed the president to dismiss judges on the Constitutional Court and other senior judges. It granted the president lifelong legal immunity, so he cannot be prosecuted for anything whilst in the presidency or after he steps down, retires, or is voted out or whatever. Although he'll never be voted out, because the one thing I won't cover in this is the corruption in the elections, but that's a whole other story. So it's really confined to stepping down or something else. He also was able to appoint 30 new senators to the Russian Federation Council, not elected senators, but appointed by the president for, quote, outstanding services to the state or society, unquote. So therefore, massive direct control in the Federation Council. Also ensuring that the nation's actions in, quote, defending the fatherland, unquote, must not be questioned. Also prohibiting so-called, quote, separatist acts and speech, unquote. So that gives a lot of political authority over rivals and so forth. Now, I said there were 206 amendments in this package. Not all of them were bad. Okay, I just pulled out the clangers, but not all of them were bad. For example, the enshrining of certain conservative values like family, like traditional marriage, like the protection of children. Also things like the minimum wage. There was disability rights, environmental protection, entrepreneurship measures, and so forth. Widely speculated that these amendments were principally included at the same time to ensure public support for the whole package of 206 amendments because it went to a public vote. Overall, however, and I'll get to that in a second, but overall the changes make Putin one of the most powerful presidents in the world. They reflect a rejection of foreign influence. There's a bit about that. They reflect a rejection of liberalism and a rejection of Western power. I'm not opposed to that last point at all. I'm not, just a blind champion of the West. I think countries should have their own way, and he's done all of those things. Let's call that morally neutral, that last one. Now, I did spend a lot of time reading through a number of these amendments, and I have team members that helped source them and translate them, which is great. And here's a couple of the interesting ones, which are not related to his accruing to himself extra power, but some other interesting points. Firstly, and I'm going to quote, protection of the family, motherhood, fatherhood, and childhood. Protection of the institution of marriage as a union of a man and a woman, creation of conditions for the decent upbringing of children in the family, as well as for the fulfillment by adult children of the obligation to take care of their parents. That's in the Constitution. That's pretty good. The Russian Federation, united by a 1,000-year history, preserving the memory of ancestors who passed on to us ideals and faith in God, as well as continuity in the development of the Russian state, shall recognize the historical formed state unity. That's another one that I just read, possibly a dodgy translation, but it shouldn't be too bad. Another translation, children are the most important priority of the state policy of Russia. The state shall create conditions conducive to the comprehensive spiritual, moral, intellectual and physical development of children and to the education of patriotism, citizenship and respect for their elders. The state, ensuring the priority of family education, assumes the responsibilities of parents in respect of children left without care. Again, that's all pretty good. Here's another one that gives hints. There's a lot of nationalism and sort of historic Russia stuff in there as well. And that's, again, not all bad. It just depends on what purpose you apply those beliefs to. But here we go. The Russian Federation shall honour the memory of the defenders of the fatherland and ensure the protection of historical truth. Belittling the importance of the feat of the people in the defence of the fatherland is not allowed. Well, it's slightly authoritarian, isn't it? But anyway, there you go. Those are some of the interesting points I picked out from the many, many amendments that I was able to go through. Now, all of these amendments were packaged together. and they went to a public vote. And here's the thing, you could only vote yes or no to all 206, okay? And there's a whole bunch of carrots being dangled in those amendments, you know, minimum wage stuff and all this kind of thing. And so you can imagine, right, the campaign that the government ran was all about the good amendments that people were going to love. No one talked about the extension of Putin's powers and all that stuff. It just wasn't at the front of the campaign. That was the stuff that was going to go through, that they really wanted to go through, but of course it was given all of these fancy bells and whistles that people would support and go into the ballot box to say yay or nay. What are they going to do? Well, yay, because they're going to get all this extra stuff. But also there was issues with protests being shut down by police. The voting process was kind of dodgy. It went out over several days, made it harder to administer, keep track, and there's lots of anecdotal reports of corruption issues and votes being double counted and people, all sorts of stuff. Anyway, the fact also that the vote was not an official referendum was significant. It enabled avoidance of all of the strict transparency measures which referendums usually require. It was just a national vote, not a referendum at all. So kind of they could play fast and loose with all of the rules, and I won't go into all the detail, but just to note that that did kind of happen. Here are some, that's the constitutional amendments. They went through, obviously, and guaranteed Putin's near president for life status and all the rest of it, and a lot of those other things as well. For example, the Russian constitution, marriages between a man and a woman, that's held pretty firm, and they've rejected a number of attacks on that. So there's been some good things that got in there as well. Here's a couple of other things that are of significance in terms of laws passed under Putin's presidency or prime ministership. One of them is a federal law prohibiting propaganda of non-traditional sexual relationships. So it is, quote, against the law to spread positive information about gay, lesbian, bisexual or transgender people among minors, unquote. So that makes Ron DeSantis's bill in Florida about talking about this stuff at school to kindergarten kids and primary kids look tame, right? This is a total blanket ban. In 2021, the Russian government ignored a decision by the European Court of Human Rights, which said that their failure to allow same-sex marriage was a violation of the European Convention on Human Rights. The chairman of the Duma, which is the Russian parliament, said this: there are no additional rights for people on the grounds that they consider themselves to be minorities. This will not happen in Russia. We have a different mentality, different traditions, and most importantly, a different law. Thanks to the amendments of the Constitution, we can safely ignore any such decisions, both the decision of the European Court of Human Rights and any other bodies, due to the fact that our norms, our laws, are a priority. Fine. On the flip side, Putin is quite pro-environment, pro-climate action on a number of fronts, which has been interesting. This is just one quote. If I had time, I'd go into much more, but I don't. We must find answers to the climate challenges, adjust our agriculture, industry, the housing and utilities sector and the entire infrastructure to them, create a carbon utilisation sector, bring down emissions and introduce strict control and monitoring. Right, that's some of the policy background. Here's the point I kind of want to spend the rest of the time making. Political suppression. The real issue is not that Putin, every single thing that's ever come out of Putin's mouth is wrong or corrupt, or not that, he's never said anything good, or that anything he's ever said is bad, or that he doesn't have accurate critiques of Western culture on many fronts, which he often does. The problem is he's an autocrat. He's a despot. He's an autocrat with a KGB history, and it shows. The constitutional changes reveal that that is in his nature, this authoritarianism, this autocrat nature, but they're only the tip of the iceberg. Bluntly, there's a long history of his political rivals and people who could cause him trouble just winding up dead, and quite spectacularly dead. And those that live to this day continue to endure attempts on their lives and trumped up legal cases and criminal charges and all manner of harassments from the administrative arm of the Russian state. How so, you say? Well, some of you will know these cases, but I have found that a lot of people just don't appreciate them, and they're quite condemning. I'm going to go through 5 main cases quickly. The first one is Alexander Litvinenko. He's a former KGB officer. He died in 2006, 3 weeks after drinking tea laced with radioactive plutonium-210 in a London hotel. He had the poison put in his tea by 2 former KGB officers. Now, those who remember that story, it's pretty confronting and shocking because he died slowly of radiation poisoning and he looked like it. Now, Litvinenko had been dismissed from the FSB, which is the KGB's successor, after publicly alleging illegal activity within the FSB. He blew the whistle on the fact that, he says, Putin was involved in an organised crime group smuggling heroin from Afghanistan through Uzbekistan via St. Petersburg into Western Europe, making spectacular wads of cash. And those of you who know the thing about the Putin Palace thing, Who knows? The money's got to come from somewhere. He was granted asylum by the British government, and he vocally and continually criticised Putin, and his knowledge of the inner workings of the FSB and the regime really was a means by which he analysed Putin's actions publicly and was sought after for that reason. Poisoned in his tea. On his deathbed, he says this to Putin. He says, "You may succeed in silencing me, but that silence comes at a price. You have shown yourself to be as barbaric and ruthless as your most hostile critics have claimed. You've shown yourself to have no respect for life, liberty, or any civilized value. You've shown yourself to be unworthy of your office, to be unworthy of the trust of civilized men and women. You may succeed in silencing one man, but the howl of protest from around the world will reverberate, Mr. Putin, in your ears for the rest of your life. May God forgive you for what you have done, not only to me, but to beloved Russia and its people." It's probably true, you know. That kind of probably was a big turning point at which Putin, has suffered reputationally ever since. Another one, Anna Politkovskaya, all these surnames. A writer and a journalist authored the book Putin's Russia, which made the case that Putin had turned Russia into a police state, and she was an adamant critic of Putin. She was shot dead with a silenced pistol at point-blank range outside her apartment in October 2006. The court found that it was a contract killing worth $150,000 paid by an anonymous party. 4 people were arrested in connection with the assassination. It wasn't clear who exactly pulled the trigger. A 5th person fled Russia on a forged passport, which was issued by staff at Russia's Department of the Interior. Now, the European Court of Human Rights made a decision about this, acting on an application from Anna's family, and they found a whole bunch of stuff. Basically, what it was that the Russian authorities never went into any detail. They found the 4 guys, and that was it. They said, "Oh well, it was a contract killing. You know, a hitman. It was someone paid a hitman." Well, who paid them? They didn't look into it. Well, where did the orders come from? What's the background of the issue? They didn't look into it. Well, who actually did the killing? They didn't even decide. So the European Court of Human Rights was pretty strong on the fact that this was a corrupt trial. Boris Nemtsov. Nemtsov was formerly the Deputy Prime Minister of Russia under Boris Yeltsin. He was expected to succeed Yeltsin, but the role went to Putin instead. You remember I mentioned that earlier. He and his party went into opposition, and from there he was a vocal critic of Putin. He authored several reports on the state of corruption, and vocally criticised Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea. A few days after he spoke out against the Russian invasion, Nemtsov was gunned down with several shots in the back as he walked with his girlfriend outside the Kremlin, which is the Russian parliament building. Again, 5 men were tracked down. It was said to be a contract killing worth 15 million rubles, but no substantial investigation traced the source of the funds or the orders that were behind it. Among the suspects, there are direct connections to the highest political and military authorities in Chechnya, as well as at least one direct connection to President Putin. Again, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe has noted that the case was completely riddled with inconsistencies. For example, there was no security camera footage supplied by the FSB at all. It disappeared. There was a failure to question a lot of the witnesses who were there. There was a failure to interrogate the connections that were mentioned to the military establishment and the government establishment and to Putin himself. There was major forensic impossibilities with regards to the bullets and shell casings which came out in the forensic analysis, and also the evidence supplied by witnesses who were called to testify was completely contradictory. So again, it's the familiar pattern. Alexi Navalny, this one's very famous. Most people know about this guy. He's the most prominent face of Russia's opposition at the moment with 2.7 million Twitter followers and 6.43 million YouTube subscribers. He's been barred from running as a presidential candidate, and authorities refused to register his political party. That's all based on a criminal conviction, which is for embezzlement, which Navalny and others say is entirely politically motivated. And of course, these things come up just as he's doing political stuff. And he's been leveled with a whole bunch of new criminal charges, along with his associates, since he's gone back to Russia recently. So it is a familiar thing. European Court of Human Rights found that the Convention on Human Rights was violated in relation to all 7 of his arrests prior to his latest arrest, which is more recent, and his pre-trial detentions violated the Convention on 2 occasions. In 2017, April, he was sprayed with chemicals by an assailant on 2 occasions. He lost 80% of his vision in his right eye and he suffered chemical burns. Then famously in August 2020, he fell seriously ill on a flight. He was taken to Berlin for treatment, where tests confirmed that he was poisoned with Novichok, a nerve agent developed by the Soviets. He nearly died and he took many months to recover in intensive care. Navalny returned to Moscow in January 2021, where he was immediately arrested and imprisoned, and since then more criminal charges for embezzlement have been opened against him and his associates, as I said. And when directly asked in a media interview in 2021 whether he would personally ensure that Navalny will leave prison alive, unquote, Putin did not directly do so and referred to the grave impression he has on the medical facilities in prison. I have the quote here. I won't read it all out, but it's quite stunning. He sort of says, oh, well, he goes, you know, all those decisions are made by other people, not me. Oh, but by the way, I did visit a prison in St. Petersburg a while back, and he says, oh, I had a very grave impression that the medical facilities were extremely bad. And that's all he says. And then the interviewer says, well, people will note that you weren't prepared, quote, people will note that you weren't prepared to say that he would leave prison alive, unquote. And Putin responded, oh, I don't care. Sergei Skripal, the last one I'll go through, a former Russian intelligence officer who shared Russian secrets with Britain's MI6. He was charged, he confessed, and he was convicted of high treason and espionage in Russia. He was pardoned in 2010 as part of a prisoner exchange, and he went to the UK. In March 2018, he and his daughter were poisoned with Novichok, though he survived, and British police have been unable to arrest the suspects because they are believed to be in Russia. Surprise. Those are some examples. I could have mentioned the assassination of liberal politician Sergei Yushchenkov. I could have mentioned the poisoning of investigative journalist Yuri, I'll never be able to say his surname, Shekoshikin, Schekoschikin. I can be excused for not knowing that one. The shooting of Forbes magazine Russian editor Paul Klebnikov in Moscow, the abduction and killing of human rights activist Natalia Estemirova, the shooting by a masked gunman of human rights lawyer Stanislav Markalev and journalist Anastasia Babarova, the strangling of Russian oligarch Boris Berezovsky after he fled Russia due to a falling out with Putin, and the bludgeoning to death of Mikhail Lesin, the founder of Russia Today's news network, as he was negotiating a deal with the FBI to protect himself from corruption charges. There are some more, and I rehearsed all those names, but in the speed of the moment, I just can't do it. It's too much of a tongue twister. Finally, I'm not going to spend any meaningful time on Putin's expansionist and nationalist military objectives because I did that in my previous video, What's Putin Thinking? You can look at that at your leisure. But it simply analyses Putin's own speech on the day before he invaded Ukraine and makes the conclusions from it that shows he does have an expansionist, a nationalistic and a militaristic and a hostile objective in his region. And there's been a number of military conflicts that he's been responsible for: the Second Chechen War, the 2014 annexation of Crimea, the separatist war in the Donbass region of the Ukraine, the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, and the 2008 South Odessa, Georgia conflict. Basically, he stirs up trouble amongst separatists, creating an excuse to roll in and take over. And I understand that's a controversial statement, but truthfully, that is true. I can't back down from that, and I don't care whether, I don't think that George Soros's opposition of Vladimir Putin makes that an incorrect statement. It's a correct statement. That's a summary of over 100 pages of summarized research. So there was much, much more I could have said. But the reason I said what I said was this: Putin is right in many ways about his analysis of the West's immorality. He's right about his analysis of the decadence and the similar evils that exist in the West. He's right to analyse some of the dangers of Western liberalism. And yes, he has promoted some conservative and some decent values in his constitution. And he uses a lot of this as rhetoric. And it's a very, very clever tactic. He may believe a lot of it. That's all fine and good. You know, we all know that. And yes, George Soros hates him, as I just said. And yes, the Great Reset types hate him. And yes, a lot of the Western establishment hates the guy. And some of their hate towards him is on false grounds. But see, a lot of it's on good grounds. You know, you can agree with even the most disagreeable person sometimes on some things. And none of the things that people are looking at that Putin does or says that they resonate with make him a good guy. They don't even make him 1% of a good guy. He's a despot. He's an autocrat. He runs an authoritarian. He runs a wicked regime. He's a killer. He's a ruthless killer. The end. That is the truth about Vladimir Putin.